Gaudete, gaudete, Christus es natus, ex Maria Virgine gaudete.
Welcome to the Rediscovery channel. This is the channel where I, Ivar Kovac, and my good friends Stilgar and Great Pharaoh take turns coming up with topics from history that the other person doesn't know about and quite often hasn't heard about. Today, I have a topic for you guys that you probably heard about, but don't know everything there is to know. So I'm going to ask you guys, have you heard of Atlantis?
City?
Neil?
You mean the great lost city of Atlantis?
Yes.
Yeah, I've heard of it. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I've heard of it too. Like, I think they made like a movie out of it.
Indiana
cool.
Jones.
It's like, yeah,
Yeah,
something along those lines. I've heard of it.
There's been, Atlantis is pretty, today the legend of Atlantis is pretty ubiquitous. I think people have heard of it in every part of the world. And of course, it keeps getting visited by the entertainment industry. You know, there's Stargate Atlantis series that Stilgar and I both watched and enjoyed. And, Marvel Comics, they have their version of Atlantis. DC has their version of Atlantis, and so on and so forth. But if I ask you guys, where does the Atlantis legend come from? I think most people would be surprised to find that it comes entirely from just one person. So
Plato?
Yeah, Plato. Yeah. So Plato is the author of the oldest still existing record of Atlantis. And Plato, he lived from either 428, he was born in either 428 or 427, and he died in 348 or 347 BC. So they're not quite sure about his birth and death date, but thereabouts. So the Atlantis account appears in the Timaeus and Critias dialogues, which are fictitious dialogues that exist to explain kind of the nature of the world and early history. So, in other words, it's like it's a fictitious dialogue to explain what was supposedly true or thought to be true. So Timaeus and Critias dialogues include 4 characters, and that is Timaeus, Critias, Socrates, and Hermocrates. And Hermocrates really doesn't say much. Most of the speech comes from Timaeus and Critias. So most of these guys were believed to be real people. Didn't all exist at the same time. But the Timaeus character is most likely totally fictitious. And Critias is probably based off of Plato's great-grandfather, who was a real guy. So the Timaeus dialogue comes first, and then the second book is Critias. Timaeus focuses mostly on the physical nature of the world, and of course the Greeks and Plato, they believe of 4 elements. The world is composed of 4 elements: wind, water, fire, and earth. And it talks about the shape of the universe and the origin of the universe. And Plato, he actually did not believe that the Greek gods like Zeus, Hera, Poseidon, all them were responsible for the creation of our universe. He believed that there was like a eternal God outside of the universe that created everything. And like he said, that God is unknown to us and unknowable. Like we can't know who he is. And even if we did, how would we wouldn't be able to tell other people about him. Kind of interesting, but at any rate, yeah. So at any rate, Critias is where most of the physical description of Atlantis occurs. Now, supposedly Plato, even though he's the oldest written source, he's not the original source for the Atlantis story. The source material for the story came to him through Solon, who lived from 630 to 560 BC. And supposedly Solon got the information from the Egyptian priests in Sais, who worked at the temple of Neith. And Neith was an Egyptian goddess that was supposedly like very their equivalent of Athena. And one thing that Plato says in these dialogues is he gives the Greek names for different gods in other cultures based on like he says like, yeah, they have other names in these cultures, but it's the same concept, so I'm going to use the Greek names basically. According to Plutarch, Plutarch actually gives a name for the priest that Solon spoke to, and that guy's name is Sauntius. So in case you're wondering who Solon was a famous lawgiver and reformer for the ancient Greeks, and he attempted to permanently end slavery and poverty. So he came at a time like when there was all sorts of oppression in Greece, and there was some ruling family that owned and managed most of the land, and they were pushing like small farmers out of their land and either pushing them into slavery or reducing them to serfs that would be working the land, like putting them in debt and then seizing their land, and then either selling them as slaves or retaining them to kind of work the land. So Solon issued all kinds of reforms to try and make the society better and more fair and allow for social mobility. And then what he did is he left for a while so that they couldn't, ostensibly so that they couldn't force him to like reverse his reforms. And he spent some time in Egypt. And he lived before the Greeks had taken to writing histories and biographies. So most of Solon's writings that survive comes in the form of poetry, and a lot of it is missing. And then other teachings of Solon come down in the form of oral traditions and also as fragments of laws that he established that became precedents. So Solon, he wants to talk to the priests about ancient history. And there's some interesting bit of dialogue. So the priest says, Solon, Solon, you Greeks never grow up. There isn't an old man among you. And Solon says, what do you mean? And the priest says, none of you have mature minds. You have no ancient tradition to imbue your minds with old beliefs and with understanding aged by time. And let's see here. Just for, so the Greeks had actually had a dark age, which lasted from about 1,200 to 800 BC. And it affected the Greeks pretty egregiously to the point where they actually became illiterate, like they lost their original written text. And the Egyptians, however, just continued through this time. They didn't have a dark age. So they definitely had some older records and knowledge that the Greeks did not have. And the priests tell him that the world has suffered through many cataclysms of both floods and fire. And basically, the fire and extreme heat would kill people that live at higher elevations, like up in the mountains. And then floods would kill people that live in the plains and low areas, so that a lot of the human civilizations lose their history and they have to undergo some kind of civilizational reboot. But this doesn't happen to the Egyptians because their water comes from the ground and from the Nile, and they don't have rains to kind of flood and destroy everything. And so they were able to preserve ancient history, and more so than anybody else, because of the stability of the land. So what I want to do now is read this account that was of the priest describing Atlantis. And what he says is that the Greeks forgot this, and they used to know about this story, and they took part in a war with Atlantis, but the Egyptians still have this record. So he says, our records contain many impressive and admirable exploits performed by your city. That's Athens, by the way. But there's one above all that stands out for its importance and courage. Our documents record how your city once halted an enormous force that was marching insolently against not just the whole of Europe, but Asia as well, from its base beyond Europe in the Atlantic Ocean. I should mention that in those days, the ocean there was navigable, since there was an island in front of the strait which I've heard you say your people call the Pillars of Heracles. The island was bigger than both Asia and Libya combined, and travelers in those days used it to get to the further islands, from where they had access to the whole mainland over on the other side, the mainland which surrounds the genuine sea. Everything this side of the strait is like a narrow-mouthed harbor, but that is the true sea, and the land which completely surrounds it truly deserves the name mainland. On this island of Atlantis, a great and remarkable dynasty had arisen, which ruled the whole island, many of the other islands, and parts of the mainland too. They also governed some of the lands here inside the strait, Libya up to the border with Egypt, and Europe up to Etruria. Once upon a time, they combined their forces and set out en masse to try to enslave in one swoop your part of the world and ours, and all the territory this side of the strait. This was the occasion, Solon, when the resources of your city, its courage and strength, were revealed for all to see. It stood head and shoulders above all other states for its bravery and military expertise, and at first it was the leader of the Greek cause, and then later abandoned by everyone else and compelled to stand alone. It came to the very brink of disaster, but it overcame the invaders and it erected a trophy, thereby preventing the enslavement of those who remained unenslaved this side of the boundaries of Heracles, and unhesitatingly liberated all the rest. Sometime later, appalling earthquakes and floods occurred, and in the course of a single terrible day and night, the whole fighting force of your city sank all at once beneath the earth, and the island of Atlantis likewise sank beneath the sea and vanished. That is why the sea there cannot now be navigated or explored. The mud which the island left behind as it settled lies a little below the surface and gets in the way. So basically, these people, whoever they were, ruled the area of Africa that we would call the Maghreb. So like North Africa going as far east as the border of Egypt. And they also ruled part of Europe as well. So Etruria, in case anybody's wondering, that refers to Italy, or the part of Italy that was ruled over by the Etruscans at the time. So that should give you kind of an idea. And then the Pillars of Heracles is a reference to the Strait of Gibraltar. So it's kind of a bit older language. And from this, basically, you can infer that the Greeks, they defeated these people and went all the way to their homeland. And the Greek army was there when Atlantis was destroyed. So they died as well, which, if true, could be another reason why the Greeks didn't know as much about it as the Egyptians. I mean, if none of their people come back from the disaster, then there definitely would be some gaps in the record. But at any rate, let's see, let's continue. So what is Atlantis like is the next question. And it's not nearly as, it's pretty interesting. It's not nearly as fantastic as it's depicted in fiction. So this comes from the second dialogue, Critias. And I should add the quote that I just read about the war with the Greeks is actually found in Timaeus. The first part of Timaeus is a part where Critias relates that story. And I don't know why it was put in Timaeus, but the rest of Timaeus is all like cosmological stuff and stuff dealing with nature and biology. But this is getting into the Critias dialogue here. So according to Critias, Poseidon gained the island of Atlantis as his province, and he settled there the children born for him by a mortal woman in a certain part of the island. To be specific, halfway along the coastline, there was a plain which is said to have been unsurpassable in its beauty, and good and fertile too. Close to the plain and halfway along its extent, about 50 stades distant from the coast, there was a hill of no great prominence. There lived on this hill a man who was one of the original earthborn men of the land. He was called Evenor, and he lived with his wife Leucippe. They had just one child, a daughter called Clito. When the girl reached the age of marriage, both her mother and father died, but Poseidon, who had come to desire her, made her his concubine. He gave the hill where she lived secure defenses by breaking it off from the surrounding land and creating increasingly large concentric rings alternately of land and water around it. 2 of the rings were of land, 3 of water, and he made them equidistant from the center, as if he had taken the middle of the island as the pivot of a lathe, and so the island became inaccessible to others, because in those days ships and sailing had not yet been invented. Poseidon, as a god, easily organized the central island. Once he had fetched up 2 underground springs, one warm, the other flowing cold from its source, and caused all kinds of food to grow in sufficient quantities from the soil. He fathered and reared 5 pairs of twins. Then he divided the island of Atlantis into 10 parts. He gave the firstborn of the eldest twins his mother's home and the plot of land around it, which was larger and more fertile than anywhere else, and made him king of all his brothers, while of the others many subjects and plenty of land to rule over. He named all his sons. To the eldest, the king, he gave the name from which the names of the whole island and of the ocean are derived. That is, the ocean was called the Atlantic because the name of the first king was Atlas. To his twin, the one who was born next, who was assigned the edge of the island, which is closest to the pillars of Heracles and faces the land, which is now called the territory of Gadara, after him. He gave a name which in Greek would be Eumilus, though in the local language it was Gadiris. And so this must be the origin of the name Gadira. He called the next pair of twins Amphiras and Evamon. He named the elder of the third pair Minucius, and the younger one Autochthon. Of the fourth pair, the eldest was called Elasippus, and the younger Mestor. In the case of the fifth pair, at any rate, I'm not going to, oh wait, yeah, I should read the rest of this. He called the firstborn Azaeus, and the secondborn Diaperpus. So all his sons and their descendants lived there for many generations, and in addition to ruling over numerous other islands in the ocean, they also, as I said before, governed all the land this side of the Pillars of Heracles up to Egypt and Etruria. So I mentioned before, Etruria is Italy, or at least the Tuscan region. And Gadara, in case you guys don't know, it still exists today. It's called Cadiz. It's in Spain. So the Romans, they called it Gadis or Gades. I'm not really sure how it's pronounced. But then today it's called Cadiz. So it looks like, these people, they also ruled over a significant portion of Europe as well. And now, as far as like the description, I'm not going to read you guys the whole story. There's other videos on YouTube that people could watch where some people actually do read like all of Critias and stuff. But what I want to do is just describe the more significant aspects of Atlantis, like how it was. So, supposedly it was founded by Poseidon and his oldest son Atlas that he has with the human woman founds the ruling dynasty. So according to Plato in Critias, the island of Atlantis received a lot of sunlight. So Plato describes it as being sun-drenched. And during the winter, it would rain. So it's not a place that gets cold. And it's a place that seems to have dry summers and the rain during the winter. So kind of like India. But obviously this is not India. It's to the far to the west of that. So, but I guess you would call that a monsoon climate. I'm not really sure. I think maybe that's what it's called. But the island includes both mountains and plains. It had forests, which gave all sorts of timber, abundant timber that was used in construction and shipbuilding, and it's what allows the Atlanteans to build a big navy and create a major trading empire by sea. There's a good deal of land suitable for grazing and farming, so that every kind of produce in the ancient world can be grown there, both dry grains as well as fruits. And the plains are so, I guess, fertile that there's enough food for both domesticated and wild animals, including elephants, which existed in large numbers in Atlantis. Elephants, that's important. So there were also abundant ore veins with every kind of metal that could be wanted. And there were mining operations that went on constantly. There's a metal or substance called orichalc, which Plato says was the second most valuable mineral after gold, but he didn't know what orichalc actually was. And I don't think anybody does to this day.
Do you have any idea what that mineral looked like?
Orichalc, I think it's yellowish in color, and they used it to surface the walls of some of the fancier buildings.
Oh, okay. Okay, cool. That does sound
Yeah.
like precious like metal.
Yeah, I know it's something that was lost in the translation, and probably, these people, they probably didn't worship Poseidon, but some other god of the sea. And actually, I have a theory about that, but I'll get to that. I'll get to that near the end. So, yeah, I don't know what orichalc is. You guys' guess is as good as mine. It's some kind of metal, I suppose, or maybe sulfur, but I don't know that you would. Sulfur is kind of powdery. I don't think you'd want to cover a building with that. It also smells nasty. So also, like, they dug canals all through the island at regular intervals, and these canals serve the purpose of irrigation during the summer. And by the way, they would have 2 harvests every year, not just one. So they would provide water for the crops during the summer when there was no rain. And they were also used for moving freight throughout the island and down to the sea. And not everybody lives in the capital city. There's many wealthy villages, people living in both the mountains and the plains region. The capital city is the area that was supposedly cut by Poseidon, with a central island that has 2 springs coming up, one warm and one cold. And it's surrounded by 3 rings of water and two rings of land. So you think kind of like a target, like a dartboard kind of looking thing. So channels were cut through the rings so that ships could get in and out as far as the central island of the capital. These are covered over so that they were more like tunnels, and I guess people could walk and ride across the top of them. And the tunnels were large enough to admit 1 ship at a time, probably for security purposes. There were also bridges connecting each of the land rings. And then in the central island, the royal palace and capital are there in the central island. And the temple of Poseidon, or whatever sea god they worship, is covered with silver on the outside. And on the inside, it was mostly covered with orichalc, at least the walls were. But the ceiling contained ivory, gold, silver, and again, orichalc. And, reading this, some people are going to be like, yeah, that's fake. And, I can't rule out the possibility that it's fake, if I'm going to be honest. But if you guys recall, from reading the Bible, Solomon, when he built his temple, he covered the inside completely with gold. Like, he had his cedar and then his relief carvings that he did, and then plated it all with gold. And I think the doors were also covered with gold too, right? So probably, if you stop and think about it, the Temple of Atlantis was still not as fancy as Solomon's temple. But still quite fancy, I imagine. And so water from the springs is used to fill baths and to nourish the gardens. There were some nice gardens in the central island. The extra water is sent out to the outer rings through pipes, which ran along the sides of the bridges. So these guys had running water, but probably only in the capital city. And they quarried stone from both the central island and some of the rings, which was white, black, and red. And some of the buildings would be simple in appearance, but with others, they would mix the different colors of stone to create patterns. And also, they carved as they carved the bedrock, they created docks that were kind of underground with like a roof of stone going over them. Yeah, so the royal family lives in the central round island in the middle, and then the rings is where mostly soldiers live, and also horses, and they they had gardens and gymnasiums, so that everybody could get buff and swole. And those gymnasiums were also for humans and also for horses as well. And the more trusted soldiers would live on the first ring of land that surrounds the central island. And then probably like officers and such. And then the outer ring was home to soldiers that are, I guess, of lower rank. And the outer ring had a hippodrome in the center, which I believe, if I understand correctly, ran all the way around the island in a complete circle. And they would use this, like the hippodrome would be where chariots and stuff would race, and horses. So then a canal connects the outer ring of water to the sea. So these guys had access to the ocean, the Atlantic Ocean, from the capital city, even though the capital city was further inland. So the capital city also had a rectangular plain outside of it. And it wasn't a perfect rectangle by nature, but the Atlanteans, they dug a channel going all around it, or a trench, which was pretty deep. And so it became a perfect rectangle once the trench was dug. And then beyond the plain, there was mountains, and all sorts of streams were coming down the sides of these mountains, and people also lived in the mountains, like rich people. You can think kind of like Hollywood, type of thing, where they live up there, Hollywood Hills or whatever. And this water that flowed down from the mountains would flow into this trench that surrounded the plain. So these guys, they took a lot of measures to control the flow of water and make sure that they didn't get wrecked by it. And now I want to talk about a possible location for Atlantis, like where this might have actually been. So I think I may have found it, or not me, but other people, but I think I might know where it is. So have you guys heard of the Richat structure?
The Richat structure. Okay. Well, I'm going to have to pull up you said Richat structure?
Yeah, it's spelled Richat. You can look it up.
It comes right up. It's a deeply eroded, slightly elliptical dome with a diameter of 40 kilometers. Oh my goodness.
Look at the pictures of it. You can do an image search and you'll see. Yeah.
Holy cow. This is a real place?
Yeah, man.
This is the Richat structure. This is unbelievable.
Yes.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, so I actually
they call it the Eye of the Sahara. Sorry to interrupt. Call it the Eye of the Sahara, right?
That's right. Actually, so I first heard about the Richat structure when I was in middle school. My grandmother, she got me a subscription to National Geographic. So I was reading that back in the day in the 90s. And I saw the Richat structure. And when I first saw it, I just thought this was fake. Because they had taken pictures of it from space, in like a space shuttle. It's large enough that you can see it from orbit. And I thought, this is fake. Because back then in the 90s, like the Voyager 1 and Voyager 2 probes were out in the solar system, Viking lander, all that kind of stuff. And in the 90s, what they had started to do is enhanced color images of the planets. So I was also interested in space exploration, and I would read all these books about planets and stuff. And I'd be like, oh, look at this moon. It's like purple and blue and all this stuff. And I'd open up like, that's so cool. Is it really that color? No, it's not that color. This is a color enhanced image. So I thought, these guys are clowning. This is a color enhanced image. This thing is just a crater or something. But actually, it turns out It's not a color enhanced image. It really is like that. If you flood it with water, you've got a central island surrounded by 2 rings of land and 2 of water, though it's not perfect because the elevation is a bit degraded in the rings. And actually, they thought originally that it was created by an asteroid or meteorite, I suppose, but there's been no evidence of that. Like there's no debris from any extraterrestrial objects. So it is not created by an impact. But what put me onto, and I have to be fair, what put me onto the Richat structure was this guy. His channel's name is Bright Insight, and he was talking about this thing and saying that it's probably the site of Atlantis, and he goes into a lot of crazy detail. And I'm not going to go into all the detail that he does, but I'm going to go into some detail. So here's some more evidence that this is probably it. And,
well, I mean, also the fact that the diameter of it is 40 kilometers. It's not like this cool looking structure and it's like 1 kilometer wide. We're talking 40 kilometers in diameter. You know,
yeah.
And once to put your audience in that perspective, you know, imagine 10 football fields being 1 kilometer. So, you know, 40 times, it's 400 football fields long in diameter. I mean, that's amazing.
And this is why it's good to have an engineer on the channel to understand the math that I can't understand. But yeah.
Oh, well.
Yeah. So
Well, hey,
yeah.
however I can.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Definitely. So who were the Atlanteans? I'm gonna say they were probably the Berbers, and I do have some evidence. So let's continue on with it. So as it happens, Atlas is also a part of Berber mythology and tradition. They refer to him as Atlas of Mauritania. But as mentioned earlier, the Atlantic Ocean is named after him. The Atlantis, it means island of Atlantis. And there's also the Atlas Mountains, which are named after this guy. And this is where it might get a little bit confusing. So I'm going to try and clear it up. So the Richat structure, the country that it's located in today is called Mauritania. But they take their name from the Mauritania of the ancient world. And during Roman times, that was the area of Morocco, roughly. And the people that lived there were called Maori. You know, today they called Berbers, and but they were called Maori, which is also where the term Moors come from. So, of course, the Richat structure is further south than the old Roman province of Mauritania. But as you know, people move around. The ancient realm of Mauritania was probably much larger than the Roman province. And I'm going to get into why. So as far as Atlas of Mauritania goes, he's thought to be the first king of the Maori people, according to their legend. He was also an astronomer who determined that stars have spherical shapes. And he also came up with something called the celestial globe. I'm not quite sure what that is. If I find out, though, I'll put it in the slideshow.
Sure.
And there's also some evidence that the Sahara Desert used to be green in the past. Like it used to be a place of that was good for farming and grazing lots of cattle. And in addition, it could support wildlife. So scientists have found the remains of a vast river system that would be the 12th largest drainage system in the world if it were still functioning today. And cave paintings have been found in the Sahara Desert, which depict elephants and giraffes.
Wow.
Yeah, so they used to be there. And then there's a huge river. It's not a river today. It's like a dried up riverbed, but it used to be a big river, which today they call the Tamanrasset. Who knows what it would have actually been called back in the day? But the Tamanrasset, it flows, or the northernmost tributary of it flows down from the Atlas Mountains and all the way to the ocean, out into the ocean in the area that today we would call Mauritania. So it's possible that Atlantis was not necessarily an island, but almost an island because this river was so huge. So the ancient, this is stuff that was passed down orally. for a while before it was written down, so we can't expect it to be completely perfect. As for the Richat structure itself, it does fit the description pretty well, and it's large enough to be seen from space, which I already mentioned. There's actually a mountain range to the north of it, and you can see all sorts of evidence of erosion coming down from those mountains. It's pretty blatantly and obviously visible. And furthermore, if you look at the shots of this place from space, you can see there's big, huge, massive flows of sand and dirt going across, as if there was a great and catastrophic flood that just washed over it and instantly left these deposits. And of course, I have pictures of all this. I'll put it in the slideshow. They have found artifacts in the Richat structure, which include arrowheads, ship anchors, pottery, and quite a few stone spheres. And there's a website called Visiting Atlantis, which I'll put a link to below. And it was put together by these two archaeologists, George Alexander and Natalis Rosen, who studied this area. And they took pictures of their findings. As far as I know, there are no governments that are actively studying the Richat structure. Like as I mentioned earlier, like originally people just thought it was a meteorite, a crater from a meteorite. And there's no evidence of that. They were not able to prove that. The official establishment position that the so-called scientific establishment usually has when it comes to this Richat structure is that it's a volcanic dome that was eroded into a series of circles over millions of years. Now, I've never seen a situation where erosion usually just rips away dirt and cuts into stone, but it usually doesn't cut it into a series of circles. So for me, that's kind of a tall order. And also these people say millions of years. I don't believe it. I think it's pretty obvious that this thing, it looks to me like an artificial thing, you know?
Yes.
So I just can't see that. And the fact that they're finding artifacts there shows that it used to be inhabited. Today, it's not a place where hardly anybody lives. It's not like the most inviting of places anymore. It's a desert.
Right.
And of course, the process of desertification is still going on in the Sahara. It's pushing further south every day. Some people, the version of Timaeus and Critias I have was translated by Robin Waterfield, and somebody else wrote the introduction to it. Let's see what this guy's name is here. Andrew Gregory wrote the introduction, where he kind of tries to add context to it and explains. And this guy has no idea where Atlantis actually is, and he came to the conclusion that it probably doesn't exist. It's probably faked because they didn't find anything out in the Atlantic Ocean beyond the Strait of Gibraltar. And they also suggested maybe it was Crete. But the thing is, like, Crete is in the wrong place. It's inside of the Straits of Gibraltar. It's not larger than Anatolia and Libya put together. And furthermore, it does not have elephants. So there's no way it could be Crete. But it, a lot of Africa does protrude beyond the Straits of Gibraltar. So there you go. And there is actually a little bit of evidence that corroborates Atlantis potentially being there. And this comes from the Nubian culture, which lived to the south of Egypt. So there's an artifact that was found in a Nubian tomb, which is being called the Nubian egg. It's an ostrich egg that has some designs or images etched into it. Right now, it's actually at it's in Egypt in the Nubian Museum at Aswan. And it's an ostrich egg, which appears to have a depiction of the Great Pyramids and the Nile River. And then at the top of the egg, there is some concentric circles. They just have, I think, see the top of the egg, it's got like 2 of land and 2 of water, basically. And supposedly this egg, was carbon dated to be 7,000 years old. And if that's true, then that would mean that the Great Pyramids of Egypt are older than was previously thought. I don't really trust carbon dating because whenever they go to do that, they have to go on certain assumptions like how much carbon was originally in the object, and then they have to assume that nothing external happened to deplete it. Like they have to assume that it depletes at a constant rate. So I think it's very unreliable, and but it is. They did find this egg in like a Nubian tomb that was built before the Nubians built their own pyramids, which means that it must have been the Egyptian pyramids. And the thing at the top does look kind of like Atlantis, and there's also medieval maps which show rivers flowing through the Sahara. So I think, that probably is the best and most likely case that of a location for Atlantis. Now, I do have a few doubts. Like one is I'm not sure how much I can trust Plato because he does put his own politics and spin on things. So, like, he doesn't just in the Critias dialogue, he doesn't just describe Atlantis. He also describes how Greece used to be in the ancient times. And one of the things that he says is that the ancient Athenian army used to also include women in equal measure, and that the men and women would both fight, and they would have like all the same. They would do all the same tasks, and that they would never own property or land or try to seize control of the government. They would just work as soldiers. And the thing is, like in the ancient world, the only culture that I know of that really made significant use of female soldiers was the Scythians. And the Scythians used to fight with the Greeks. And the Scythians, I think something like, it's been a long time since I did the video, but like a fourth or a third of the Scythian women also participated in the fighting. But with them, it's different because they didn't really wear much in the way of armor. And they made heavy use of like horseback cavalry and archers.
Sorry to interrupt. When you say Scythian, are we still referring to the residents in Atlantis?
No, sorry. The Scythians are an Iranic culture that used to live in the Russia, the area that today is called Russia. And they used to fight with the Greeks a lot during the ancient world. And the Greeks were kind of freaked out by them because the Scythians would make use of female soldiers. They'd still kill them, they still kill them in the fights, but they were kind of disturbed by that because and so the difference is like the Greeks, they used heavy armor and they fought mostly on foot. They had their phalanxes, their heavy armor, their shields, and their spears. And so in their culture, you wouldn't put women into that kind of situation. Just carrying the gear would be much tougher for them. But the Scythians were lightly armored, and a lot of times they had no armor at all, and they were a nomadic horse culture. So it made sense, for them to have female soldiers. But like Plato had this idea that in the ideal society, an equal number of the soldiers would also be women, or at least that's what he put in the dialogues. So he mentions that like as a kind of at the beginning of the Timaeus dialogue, he mentions that it's like an ideal setting that the soldiers should own nothing. They should share everything in common, like communism. They should live in housing that is set aside for them, which they don't actually own. And they should be concerned about nothing but war, not try to seize control of the government, and so on and so forth. So when he talks about like this is how the ancient Greeks used to be, and it has this part where, what do you know? The soldiers used to own nothing and half of them would be female. Like, I think probably that's a clear example of, somebody just kind of putting their politics into it. So that makes me a little suspicious, but it also, he says, like in the ancient times, Greece used to be much bigger and have a lot better farmland, and that erosion and floods have made it mountainous and rocky, and that I guess the oceans rose up because there's not as much land. Like, so the ancient Greece was a much more fertile and easy place to live, and also geographically larger place than the Greece that existed at the time of Plato. Like I say, yeah. So that's just kind of my doubt. I was like, I don't know how much I can trust Plato, but it is true that Solon did go to Egypt and he did talk to those priests there. And I was wondering, do you know any? Have you heard of Sais before? Like
Saith?
Sais, yeah, SAIS.
No, doesn't come to mind.
Yeah, it's so like Egypt during the ancient world didn't get hit as hard as by like the Bronze Age collapse as some other places did.
Okay.
What would you say? I think the worst dark age that happened to Egypt was actually when the Muslims invaded, or the closest thing to a dark age. Because I know that they destroyed a lot of libraries and stuff like that. I also know that there were some pharaohs that would actually quarry older buildings and monuments in order for like materials to build new monuments to say like, hey, look what I built, kind of thing. But do you know of any dark age? Like, what, in your view, like what's the worst
I mean,
thing that happened to Egypt when the most stuff was destroyed?
the most significant you're going to get is, the destruction of the Library of Alexandria. I mean, that was the worst. You're
Yeah.
talking about an entire city that was literally like put to flames, okay, by the Muslims, by the Muslim conquest. And that library held, just centuries of the richest, literature, the most recent literature. I mean, right after the apostles, you got all these authors. We don't even know the authors and the other people who the followers of the apostles, or the people that witnessed their lives and the life when early Christianity was spreading. I mean, all that is lost, man. The entire city of Alexandria was just completely taken over.
They didn't just destroy Alexandria, though, right? I don't think.
Oh, yeah, they destroyed multiple places.
Yeah.
The worst, is probably Alexandria, because that was sort of the headquarters, you know, the Christian faith, and Egypt depended heavily on Alexandria for leadership, because that was one of the five holy cities. That's where all the bishops resided, and when there were councils and things of that nature. So,
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, that's probably the worst that I know of.
Yeah, I think so too, because I'm just wondering. So when Plato came out and he published these dialogues, it was just taken as a fact. Like, people weren't like, Atlantis, what's that? They
Yeah.
just. So I'm wondering if, it's possible that they already knew what it was, and he was just the first person that wrote it down in a way that it happened to survive. I guess whatever original source material there was in Egypt also got destroyed. Might have been destroyed by the Muslims, or it could have been destroyed earlier. Because I know the Romans, they were not big onto destroying libraries and scientific, things of value. They usually wouldn't destroy because they were like, we
Goes
can
down.
use this stuff.
Yeah. Definitely was one of the most reckless, takeovers at the time. It was bad. It was just absolutely reckless.
Yeah.
And that's what I know of. That's the. I felt like if there was anything bigger than that, I would have been able to recall. But that's the one that we always refer to as cops.
Yeah, I
So,
think that's the biggest destruction as well, because that's what I was thinking. Like, what happened to this source material if it existed? There was this temple there. The priests had all this stuff. A lot of records have been destroyed. I think the biggest destruction. Yeah, I couldn't think of anything else. That was it. So, um,
mm.
So before we close off, I'm going to engage in like a little bit of speculation about like what Atlantis must have been like, and how those people looked. So, my guess is if they're connected with the Maori, then they probably would have looked very similar to the types of people that you find in the Atlas Mountains today. And I met some of those people when I was in Morocco when I visited there years ago. And it's possible that it mentions that they ruled the islands out further into the sea. Well, we did an earlier video on the Guanches, and in that video, somebody asked me like if they were connected with Atlantis, and I didn't know at the time, but today I would say probably so. And the thing about the Guanches is they did have like architecture and a sort of, I think they did meet the metrics of civilization, but they didn't have metals on their island. So they were a population of Berbers or Amazighs that basically was isolated and didn't get conquered by Muslims or really mix with anybody else. So if you look at like the images of those people, then that's probably how the Atlanteans would have looked physically. And as for their costume and what they would have worn is anybody's guess. You still have some traditional Berber communities, today that definitely they definitely have their own very unique style of dressing. A lot of the Berber cultures, I should probably be saying Amazigh instead of Berber because I hear they don't like to be called Berbers, but they have a custom of women having tattoos, which mark different things like their marital status and I think what tribe they belong to. Okay. So you'll see it like in the Atlas populations of the Atlas Mountains, and also like some of the Kabyles or Kabyles of Algeria. They'll do it too. You can see like these women with markings on their chins and on their arms. So it's possible that they would have had similar markings. The Egyptians, they used to fight with these people a lot, like the Amazighs of Libya, which the Egyptians referred to as Timaeus. I might be pronouncing it wrong. And there's Egyptian depictions of these people that you can see in some of the artwork, like in the Book of Gates. And they don't show the women in the Egyptian depictions, but they show the men. And these guys had beards and pasty light skin. And then they would wear like a kind of a cape or a robe that was open in the front. So they didn't wear much in the way of clothing, and they had beards and they had tattoos. Now, I don't know if those are the kind of fashions that would have prevailed in the capital city of Atlantis, but you can think of it like this, like as an alternative history scenario. The Roman Empire lasted for thousands of years. If you count the Byzantine half that continued on. What would have happened if there was a massive flood or mudslide or disaster that just wiped out Rome and the surrounding territory, like in the early days when it was still the Roman Republic? Like, we wouldn't have a huge Roman civilization like we do. Well, we don't have a huge Roman civilization today, but like history would have been very different. Like most people would not have ever heard about the Roman Empire.
Right.
Like the people in the mountains in the country would survive, but the empire would not exist and probably not spread. So, yeah, you're going to say something?
No, I mean, I was just commenting. I was just acknowledging. And yeah, I mean, go on. I mean, if there was something you wanted to add there.
Yeah, so it's possible that, and bearing in mind, I'm not 100% convinced. I'm just on to something that I think is the best case, and may or may not be true. I think I'm about like 80% convinced, but there's just a few pristine cultures, which are fully original cultures that didn't borrow any elements from other civilizations. They're completely original civilizations by every aspect. So there's only a handful. You've got the Norte Chico culture of South America, which we don't know what those people called themselves, but today they're called Norte Chico. And then the Olmecs of Mexico, Egypt, and the Sumerians, the Indus Valley culture, and China. Those are the world's pristine cultures that were fully original, had their own writing, architecture, everything, didn't borrow anything from anyone else. They just existed as far back as knowledge and history goes. Later on, of course, they would share and borrow with others. But I was thinking, maybe maybe Atlantis might be a seventh one of those, because today, out of those pristine cultures, the only ones that survive really is China and Egypt. And Egypt is just hanging on by a thread, because I don't count like I think only the Coptic community can really be considered as like the continuation of Egypt, because the rest of these guys, they've all adopted like a different culture. So that one's hanging on by a thread. China's pretty big, but the rest of them, they all are gone for the most part. So maybe you could make a case that the Sumerians kind of continue to exist in the Aramaic community, but that's I don't know that I would say that. But like the Indus Valley culture did have running water, and a closed sewer system and flushing toilets. So it's not, it's not far fetched that they would have running water in the ancient times. But at any rate, that's all I got. I don't know if you guys want to add anything or.
No, I mean, I just want to say, thank you, because I thought that Atlantis was just some imaginary place that, people it was just something passed along by tradition, or somebody wrote a book like a science fiction type of book, adventure, something like that, and it was just like any other novel or book just being reproduced in Hollywood and things of that nature. But I didn't know that it is based on a place that actually exists called the Richat structure, and base that Plato described. And so, thanks for enlightening me on that. I didn't know that there was actual documentation, at least, of this place actually existing. And I've never even heard of the Richat structure. I might have seen pictures of it, but I always thought that the pictures were just fake or something. They were just like for show. And then the color, obviously, as well. I thought the coloring was also like a rendering kind of thing. But yeah, it's called the Blue Eye of the Sahara for a reason, because when you like look at it from above like that, it's blue. I don't know if that's the soil or whatever chemical reactions going on over there, but it's super cool.
There's some salt deposits there.
Okay.
Yes.
That makes okay. Yeah, salt.
Yeah, if they had that canal going to the ocean, then that probably would have made their moats, salty. And other cultures, like the idea of the Aztecs, by the way, and this may or may not be related, but the Aztecs were not the first empire in Mexico. They were like the last one before Spain came and put their foot down on that whole region. But the Aztecs, they supposedly came from another place called Aztlan, their original homeland. And they settled in Mexico, which is named after them, because they didn't call themselves Aztecs. They called themselves Mexica. But they settled in this area where there was an island out on the lake, because they were looking to live on an island surrounded by water. So I used to have a friend that thought maybe they were also connected with Atlantis, or they may have been like a working class or people that were enslaved in Atlantis. I don't know if I go all that way, but it is interesting that different cultures take different measures to protect themselves, from invasion. And one of the ways to do that is with a moat. So there's that, like the Aztecs also had that kind of idea, like, we'll live out here on this lake, and then if invaders are coming and we're really pushed, then we'll take down the bridges so they can't get to us, or like I
Mhm.
guess you can swim across the water, but you're not going to swim across the water with armor, and you're not going to push your siege craft
Sure.
across the water. That's not happening. So
Sure.
yeah, it's kind of interesting, and I was wondering if you could shed any light on like the Egyptian
Mhm.
side where they talk about Sais and the Temple of Neith and all that. I know the priests, they used to keep all kinds of records.
Timaeus, but obviously a lot of myths and stuff kind of got passed along over the centuries. But as far as what we do know as a fact, I mean, there's nothing to refute. Obviously, Egyptian civilization. I mean,
Yeah.
what you see, what you get. I remember seeing the temples at Karnak Temple actually. There's still blue and red residual paint or whatever they used back then, dye. I don't know what. Um, that's still on the pillars, from back in the day. I mean, you can just imagine all these huge giant pillars painted and they're just walking through these, huge temples, and it was a really advanced civilization. I mean, it's unbelievable what they did years ago, and there's no really like there's no really legendary stories. Everything is as real as it gets. Now, the thing that was kind of crazy was they designed Ramses II statue in such a way that the sun shines on his face once a day on his birthday. Um, I thought it was a myth, but it is for real. They already had knowledge. They had astrological knowledge of where the sun was going to hit, or that the sun was going to hit at the same place on the same day of every year. So, I mean, that's incredible. Like they built it and they had his statue facing the sunrise, so to speak, on his birthday. That the sun would hit that statue bright and early in the morning, and till this day, it still does. And that's amazing, to see the advanced technology that they had. And till this day, people really don't know how they built the pyramids. I mean,
Right.
you can manpower all you want, and just you had thousands of Jews supposedly. I don't want to sound offensive at all by this at all. I'm not. I'm just talking about a
That's it.
historical fact. You know, the first theory that I thought was the most plausible was that you basically have like 100 men, basically dragging these huge blocks, on a ramp. Like they create the ramp, and it's sort of like it's like a sliding ramp. So the block goes on the ramp, and then there's like 50 men on each side. Heck, you'd probably need more than 50 men to drag that thing, but they're about the size of a car. I mean, each block is at least 2 tons. Okay, there's just no way around it. These blocks are freaking huge, and for the life of me, I don't think any engineer can really conclude how the pyramids were built. And it's not because we weren't there. It's because it's designed in such a way that you're just like, how did they get all these blocks placed and put in place like this? Like, how are they able to do this? 3 pyramids, and it being that high and all this stuff. And what I will say is this. I mean, they say that they kind of created these like ladders. So like each block around the perimeter, they were creating these ladders so that they would be able to stack each layer of the pyramids and then kind of like go on to the next step, and they would be able to get around that perimeter until you get all the way to the top, and then they would reverse their way back so that they can close out the perimeter, which is the way they got in. They would have to go up the steps, put a block, go up, put the steps, put a block, until that whole perimeter, that ram perimeter, was completely sealed in. So that was the final. That was like the finishing touches. But even then, it's like it just doesn't look like that's even. We still don't know exactly how they did it. I mean, manpower. I think is a combination of manpower, obviously, and just extremely intelligent, um, management, extremely intelligent planning.
A lot of math,
So,
for sure.
well, I mean, what are you going to do with the math? I mean, the math is the math. I mean, the block. All you really got to worry about is the blocks, right? They're just deciding how big they want these blocks, but all they got to know is how many they want to lay on that first layer, and that's already going to tell you how high that pyramid goes. So yeah, I mean, we engineers make the best. Egyptians make some of the best civil engineers in the world. There's no doubt about it. Construction has always been an art, a master in something to always master or be a master of in Egypt, and it takes a lot of. Yeah, it was extremely intelligent engineering, and we also know for a fact that they were very religious people. They were pagans, obviously, multiple gods.
Mhm.
And the moon was considered a god. The sun, I guess, was considered a god. Um, they were just very religious, ceremonial kind of people. Super religious. Like they thought Ramses II was from God. Essentially, they treated him as a god, and that's why they went through the whole mummification process. I mean, they take their organs, like his heart, his lungs, and they would put it in these small little vessels. And till this day, I mean, I guess it's just sort of the. I mean, it's gone now. I don't know. I don't know what remains of it. What the bones are
No,
obviously.
they got Ramses' body.
Yeah, they got his body. Yeah, they definitely. I definitely saw the Tomb of Kings. Like when you go to the museum. Now, Egypt did create a whole new museum. They built an entirely new one. It was funded by Japan, Germany, a couple other countries for like $100 billion, something ridiculous. And they did so much work in the city. They created a new museum, and basically the only thing that's sort of fiction now is like people still think there's like hidden treasures, and you basically there's nothing left. I mean, they pretty much found everything that they possibly could. They dissected pretty much every single inch of the Great Pyramids. The only thing at that point is, and they actually make some like net like I guess would parallel be like Netflix shows these drama soap operas, whatever. A lot of their story plots will be around people who inherited some of these treasures. So like if you were wealthy and you were able to afford Ramses I don't know a jewelry box or whatever, or some of their like small mini sculptures and stuff, like and they were supposedly like the originals. Like yeah, I mean that's sort of not, that's fiction too, because most of them are owned by the government. If there's anything under black market, there's almost no way of telling the difference. There's so much black market stuff in Egypt when you sell all these like sculpture things, and they'll say it's original and all this other baloney. But yeah, possibly there are individuals, very rich individuals, who have original pieces around, but the whole idea that they're highly coveted, and to the extent that there will be corruption and conspiracy to try to acquire, that you'll kill your relative or something like that, to get a hold of that stuff. I mean, that's just drama, that's just soap opera, that's not real. um the overall though, like the papaya is real. Like the Egyptians starting making the first paper to essentially paint and draw and write on, the irrigation systems, um the sanitation systems, I guess, the heck, they even say that the Egyptians were the first ones to invent the condom. They basically took um the ball, I guess the ball sacks of a cow, and they processed it and they designed it into a condom. So that they had contraceptives, way back when,
First time I've
So
heard that.
oh yeah, I mean they were in the sex, and they let you know about it in a lot of their artwork, and it was just all over their artwork, in their symbolism, and they realized that, hey, look, I mean, we want to be able to sleep with these women, but we don't want to have all these kids. And I mean, the Egyptian women were apparently just so beautiful, and so they didn't need all these kids, and so yeah, I mean, but the kings definitely had a lot of children, I'm sure, or
Yeah.
maybe it was maybe they weren't big on having a lot of kids. I don't know. There was a conspiracy. They say that Ramses II did kill his uncle or something like that. That might have been true. Um, but you know what? At the same time, there's not a lot of movies that really reflect what ancient Egyptian life was like. I mean, you have, movies about Moses, and Pharaoh, you know, um, I guess it was Ramses. I guess it was Ramses the second. I guess at the time with
No,
Moses.
Ramses. No. Ramses the second was not the pharaoh when Moses was there.
Oh, okay. It's probably
Ramses, yeah, and the Great Pyramids were built earlier, probably before they had the Hebrews living there as slaves. Like, actually, I've been looking into that kind of on the side. I was thinking about eventually doing that video and doing a video on like when the Jews were there and who the pharaoh was. Uh, but it wasn't Ramses the second. Like, people think that because there's of the Ten Commandments movie, and also because of like the Bible says they departed from a place called Per Ramses or something like that.
yeah.
But there's so many there's like a Paris, Texas, and a Rome, Georgia, but that's not the same thing as the real Rome, right? And like there's a lot of Martin Luther King streets and Lafayette streets. They're not all the same. So like names get reused. And Ramses wasn't even the first. Ramses the second wasn't the first Ramses either. Like that's a baby name that they had. So yeah, no, he wasn't the one. They like to. I know they put him in like the Ten Commandments and in the Prince of Egypt movie. But
Yeah.
he came later. Probably if like what I think is the Israelites, I think were in the period of Judges. I could be wrong, but I think they were in the period of Judges when Ramses II was there, because like he was fighting with the Hittites, and the Israelites just weren't politically relevant. Like they were just basically I mean, you know what they were doing in Judges? They were like killing each other and getting stepped on by other groups like the Philistines and so on and so forth. And the Philistines, I'm pretty sure, are people that came during the Bronze Age collapse, and they settled there, and there were also some barbarians that also settled in Egypt. Like the Egyptians, they actually absorbed those barbarians and put them into the army. And those are like the guys that have the big helmets with the horns. You've probably seen them before, like these kind of weird looking dudes with these different kind of armor and like helmets with these big horn things coming off of them. Those guys came from like Sardinia or something like that. They were part of the Sea Peoples. But yeah, that's Ramses II. He was not that pharaoh. Like that pharaoh, like Ramses was beloved. You know that. There was like very popular. Whoever that pharaoh was in the book of Exodus, there's no way that guy would be considered a hero. Like whoever that guy was, people would hate his guts, and he would not be like beloved by the whole country. And there should be no body for that guy too, because he drowned in the Red Sea. So
Yeah.
but yeah, anyways, like we've definitely gotten off of the definitely got. I think Stilgar, he dropped out. He had to go.
You
But
talking about one amazing civilization and then one potential great amazing civilization.
Yeah. Well, you know the people today that are like Amazigh nationalists, you know, and you meet a lot of them on probably just by doing this video. We'll get some of them in the comment section, but they talk about this thing called Tamazga, which I'm probably pronouncing wrong. But if you look up like Tamazga on the internet, you could see like the region of Africa that they claim is like their zone. And they have their own kind of flag that they'll sometimes do like a map of Africa and superimpose this flag. It sounds a lot like Atlantis ruled that region basically, like Tamazga, you know, and they, of course, it wouldn't have been called that back then, but it kind of corresponds with the region that Berber nationalists will claim today. They influenced things all the way as they ruled all the way as far as Egypt, and then they ruled parts of Spain. So, you know, and then of course when, you know, definitely there was some type of cataclysm there, and then after this place gets destroyed, you would still have, you know, Maori and other groups of Amazigh that would exist, but they would be mainly existing in the north along the coast and in the mountains.
Sure.
So,
Sure.
yeah, it seems like it. And probably the Egyptians and Nubians knew about these people. I mean, it's a long time ago, and stuff has been destroyed. And I'm still not completely 100% sure, but I kind of think that I do kind of think in my mind that that's probably the place right there.
Yeah.
We should do some more topics on. I want to also do a topic on Ramses the Great eventually, and get into some of that stuff too. But
yeah. I mean,
at any rate, I think if you got nothing else, then I'll just go ahead and end it. I think we already went pretty long, so
yeah, that's fine. I'm good with
all right.
that. Yeah, it was really beneficial. Thanks a lot. I appreciate that, man.
Oh, cool, and thanks for coming. I'm gonna go ahead and close it off. So if anybody made it to the end this far, thanks for listening. I know we have some viewer requests that have been pending for a long time. Eventually, you know, I didn't forget about that stuff. Eventually, we'll get to that. So, see you guys in. So yeah, if you put in a request a long time ago, don't give up hope completely. But see you guys in the next one.
All right, guys.
Est natura mirante, unus renovatus est a Christo regnante. Gaudete, Christus est natus, ex Maria Virgine, gaudete.